Welcome to those arriving. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be starting in a couple of moments. I can see that people are still entering the room, so we're just going to hang on and give people a few more moments before we begin. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just going to give it one more moment. Okay, we're just past the hour and I think I'll make a start now. I'm just going to look at Rachel and see if she gives me a nod to agree. Lovely. Okay, welcome everybody and welcome to today's event on transparency in the arms trade, examining the role and efforts of the Arms Trade Treaty. My name is Verity Coyle and I serve as a senior advisor to Stimson's Conventional Defence Programme, where I work on arms trade issues. I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion and look forward to an interactive conversation with you all. I'm just going to mention that today's session is being recorded, but that's for our panelists so that we can provide it later on the Stimson's channel for people to view. The Arms Trade Treaty, or ATT, is the first global legally binding treaty to regulate international arms transfers. It's a landmark agreement in many respects, including in regard to transparency. Indeed, promoting transparency in the international arms trade is an explicit and central part of its object and purpose. The ATT establishes several mechanisms to achieve this aim, notably its requirements that states parties report on measures taken to implement the treaty and report annually on arms exports and imports. These reports have the potential to shed much needed light on national arms control systems and the dynamics of the global arms trade, thereby allowing for the identification of good practice, lessons learnt, and opportunities to strengthen existing controls and facilitating assessments of whether the ATT is achieving the desired outcome of reducing human suffering and contributing to international and regional peace, security, and stability. But has reporting under the ATT lived up to its potential? That is a key question for today's discussion, which will be an opportunity to reflect on the first 6 years of ATT implementation, consider the extent to which states parties are living up to their transparency commitments, and examine the impact the ATT has had in promoting transparency in the global arms trade. We have an excellent lineup of speakers to help us unpack these important issues. First, we'll hear opening remarks from Rainer Schmieden of the German Federal Foreign Office and Ambassador Robert Gabrielsen, who serves as permanent representative of the Netherlands to the Conference on Disarmament. Next, we'll hear from Rachel Stoll, Vice President of the Stimson Centre and Director of the Conventional Defence Programme, who will share insights from a new Stimson analysis of states parties' latest annual reports on their 2020 arms exports and imports. We're also joined today by Karina Solmoreno, coordinator of the ATT Monitor, who will discuss some of the findings of the 2021 ATT Monitor. Finally, we'll hear from Sarah Parker, Senior Policy Officer at the ATT Secretariat, who will share some of the Secretariat's thoughts on ATT reporting, as well as some of the options states parties can take advantage of to facilitate regular and effective reporting. There will be a Q&A session following the panelists' remarks. We encourage you to share any questions you may have for the panelists using Zoom's Q&A feature, which I believe will appear at the bottom of your screen. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Rainer for his opening remarks.
Thank you, and good morning to all participants in America, and good afternoon to the other ones. I'm happy to be with you again, and thanks for inviting me. And first of all, imagine CSP7 is just 2 months ago. It seems to me as if it was a year ago or so. Time is running so fast, and in fact, I think ATT is organizations' work these days, meaning that apart from the ATT resolution in the United Nations, there's not so much going on these days. In other words, Stimson, Unidir, CPRI and others keep the ATT running, if I may say so. And I would give a big thank you to you for that. Back to reporting, as far as Germany is concerned, of course, we are of the opinion that everything is very fine. In 2021, I think Germany was the first country that handed in his report. We reported in full transparency. Our reports are open to all. And so, if I may say that, I'm happy on reporting and transparency. There's not so much which I think we Germans could improve. But nevertheless, under the impression of what was said on reporting and transparency during CSP7, I had a long phone call after CSP7 with Paul Haltom on 3rd September, and I had a project idea which I would like to share with you. The idea was that some panel of high-ranking specialists, people like Paul, like Rachel or others, people of that caliber, should make a little screen on every country's report within a 2 weeks period after handing in the report, and then give a little feedback, 2-3 pages, what can be improved, what is missing, what should be done to have a better impact with that report. And Paul was quite optimistic, and he agreed to join if necessary, and so on and so forth. And then Sarah Parker is my witness. The Monday thereafter, I think it was the 6th of September, we had a nice lunch, German ATT team with the Secretariat. And then I tabled the idea during that lunch, and Mr. Dlata Dumisani, in all his modesty and in all his friendliness, he kind of discouraged me, saying that everybody can make analysis of everyone else's reports, but we should be careful in institutionalizing that, and so on and so forth. So in the end, I didn't follow up the idea. But perhaps one or the other would like to give some feedback. Perhaps it can be taken up in another format. This was the German little try to do something on reporting and transparency. And with that little intervention, I would conclude. Thanks for inviting me again, and I wish us all a nice webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmiechen. I'm going to turn over to Ambassador Robert Gabrielsen now, please.
Thank you very much, Verity, and thank you very much for the Stimson Center, but also for Control Arms for inviting me again, and also the other panelists. I'm in a really good company, so good to see you all. Normally we're sitting by the first committee in a small room in New York. This time it is a bit different. That has advantages, disadvantages. The advantage is that it's possible for everybody to join. You just need a computer and you just log on, and I see there are more than 100 participants. So welcome to all the participants. I can't see you, but I know you can hear me, and I'm really curious about your questions. So again, thank you very much for inviting me. And as the Netherlands, we are always a long-term supporter of the ATT Monitor, as you know. The ATT Monitor has become, you can say, an integral part of our annual stock taking on the implementation of the ATT. And it's truly what we would say a must read for all the ATT stakeholders. Transparency and the exchange of information are fundamental tools in the implementation of the ATT. It provides the foundation of mutual confidence and knowledge, and to have a meaningful exchange regarding the actual implementation of the treaty and the very real consequences thereof. Improper reporting limits the depth with which we can exchange ideas and erodes the confidence in the ATT process. The ongoing downward trend in reporting and public reporting is thereby a fundamental threat to the functioning of the treaty. And I think this will come back in the presentation of Rachel's and others, that the state of affairs of the reporting is actually not good. The ATT monitor, apart from highlighting these negative trends, also brings to the fore positive developments, such as countries submitting post-due reports and voluntarily offering non-required information, showing us that we can and should do better. And the ATT monitor provides concrete and tangible recommendations on how to improve reporting and make reports more meaningful and transparent. And it's up to the countries to make use of these tools. We, as the Netherlands, stand ready to take the lessons from the monitor to heart and put them into practice. We also appreciate the monitor's role in highlighting the thematic issues in the ATT. This year, it was the effective stockpile management and the eradication of illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. By highlighting the many challenges and risks surrounding stockpile management and illustrating them in a tangible way through a case study, the monitor underlines the importance of this topic and will contribute to ensuring that the topic will remain on our agenda. I'd like to thank the monitor's team for the great efforts and shared insights, and gladly hand over to them for a more in-depth look at this year's monitor. I thank you, Verity.
Thank you very much. Rachel, I'm going to come over to you now. I know that reporting and the ATT has been a huge part of your work since the treaty came into force, and it's always a delight to hear your analysis of what the state of play is. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Verity. I'm going to quickly share my screen as I have a PowerPoint of the findings from our current report. So I'm hoping you can all see that, maybe, or not. Beginning part, let's try again. Okay, I think you should be able to see the screen now. I want to thank you, Verity, for moderating this panel, and to the ATT Monitor for your great and continued collaboration. And of course, I want to thank the governments of Germany and Netherlands for their kind words and their continued support, and in full disclosure, their funding of the work that we're going to do along with the government, or that we're going to talk about today, along with the government of Switzerland. In this presentation, I will review the section of the ATT Monitor that has to do with initial reports, and then discuss the new Stimson ATT BAP report 2020 annual reports examining trends and enduring challenges, which updates much of the information that we provided in the most recent ATT Monitor. The ATT Monitor is always done, of course, for the Conference of States Parties. And so we have a few more months of data now that we can look at and expand upon. As Reiner said, it's been 2 months since the Conference of States Parties. And so many of you might have attended the launch of the ATT Monitor that we held virtually during the CSP. So I want to review some of that information. And as I said, just provide some updates as we're lucky enough to have additional data, which is a good thing so far. So as of June, or when I briefed the conference earlier this year, I told you that as of June 7th, 2021, 105 states parties were required to submit to the ATT Secretariat their initial reports on treaty implementation. And many of you know that these reports are required for all states parties to report on measures they have undertaken to implement the ATT within the first year of their, after the first year of their entry into force. And these reports are really essential to understanding how states parties interpret their obligations, and where crucial gaps remain. Although the submissions for each state party vary, many longtime states parties have yet to complete their initial reports, which leads to a less than complete picture of ATT implementation. By that June 7th date, 81 states parties had submitted their initial reports, which is a compliance rate of approximately 77%. As of today, so 28 October, there are actually 109 states parties now that are required to submit their reports. So 4 more have been required. 84 have done so. So we still have a compliance rate of 77%, but we have 3 new reports that we can look at and examine. What's interesting is there are also states parties that are submitting reports that were due many years ago in 2015, 2017, and 2019. And their past due reporting marks the 2nd year in a row in which multiple states parties have submitted their overdue reports to the ATT Secretariat. And I think this is actually a really positive shift for reporting compliance and eases the stigma of late reporting. I know I say this every presentation. It is never too late to submit a report, both an initial report and annual report. Even if it's after the deadline, states are still welcome to submit those reports. Of the six of the 8 states parties that have submitted initial reports since the publication of last year's ATT Monitor have elected to make those reports private, which is increasing a very concerning trend in private reporting on ATT implementation. So only 2 of those new 8 reports that we have to look at were public reports, which is, again, makes it harder for analysis. Of all of the reports submitted so far, 20 are private, which is about 24%, so almost a quarter of all submitted reports. And this really represents a growing challenge for efforts to monitor and assess the ATT's impact and to identify any gaps or even available capacity to support comprehensive implementation. I think the underlying question remains as to why states parties choose to report privately, and this is worth further examination, which we'll talk about. The number of states parties that are non-compliant with their initial reporting requirements remains relatively constant. We have 25 states parties that are yet to submit their initial reports despite being required to do so. What's interesting is we looked at how late were reports this year. 3 reports are less than 4 months delinquent. So there are some newer states parties that just haven't submitted their reports yet. There are 4 states parties that are 1 to 2 years late in their initial reporting. And then we have 18 states parties that are more than 3 years delinquent in meeting their reporting requirements. So it's really important to remind longtime states parties of this obligation and that it is never too late to report. We talk a lot about synergies with other reporting instruments when we talk about ATT reporting, and we hear about reporting burden. I think what's really interesting, of those 18 states parties that are more than 3 years delinquent in their ATT reports, 9 of them, so half of them, actually have submitted a program of action, small arms and light weapons report in the last 3 years. So we know there's a lot of overlap in those reports. We know that it means that states have the capacity to complete reports if they're submitting their POA report. And so that is, again, another talking point in encouraging states to report. Article 13.1 of the treaty also requires states parties to update their initial reports and to provide the ATT Secretariat with new information on new measures undertaken in order to implement the ATT. Since the publication of the 2020 ATT Monitor, only 1 state party, that's Hungary, has submitted updates to its report. And so that joins Japan, New Zealand, Slovenia, and Sweden as the only 5 states parties that have submitted updated initial reports. We know from workshops, from interventions at conferences on states' parties, to conversations or events like these, that states are taking their obligations seriously and updating their national practices to ensure implementation of the ATT. We want to celebrate those improvements in their national systems and highlight them, but we need states parties to report on those achievements so that we can have a conversation about them. Now I want to turn now to discussion of the new Stimson report looking at the 2020 annual reports. So that's for the calendar year 2020. Yes, I recognize it's 2021, but we're looking backwards at the previous year's report. Of the 110 states parties to the ATT as of 17 September, 105 were required to submit a report to the Att Secretariat on their arms exports and imports that occurred during the 2020 calendar year. 59 states parties had done so as of 17 September, which was our cutoff for this report, which is only a compliance rate of 56%. And that is the lowest compliance rate in the first 6 years of ATT annual reporting. It does represent a 2% increase from when we had this event last October. We only had 54% of states parties reporting. And so if current practice holds, we know that more states will submit their reports in the coming 2 months, which may ultimately result in a higher compliance rate. I think we're still dealing with a lot of the challenges that many states parties continue to face as a result of the COVID pandemic, as well as evidenced by reporting behaviors over the course of the pandemic that states are just a little bit tardy in their reporting. As I said, it is never too late to submit reports. And so I encourage states that have not yet submitted to do so. 46 of the 59 reporting states parties submitted their 2020 annual reports by the Secretariat's de facto deadline of June 7th, which is an online compliance rate of about 44%. This is actually an increase from the previous year in which only 38% of states parties did so by the deadline. And I think that's, we're seeing sort of a standard 44%-ish compliance rate on on-time reporting. Again, it's never too late, but it's important for states to meet that reporting deadline. And it coincides, which I'll talk about in a moment, the UN Register's reporting deadline. So you can check 2 boxes by May 31st. 8 states parties were required to submit their first ATT annual reports in 2021, but only 3 of those states parties actually met that obligation. And one of those, the Maldives, had previously submitted an annual report for the previous year, even though it wasn't required to do so at the time. So a little example of good practice, you can get in the habit even before they are actually due to complete those reports. So 46 states parties still have to submit their 2020 annual reports. And as I said, many of these states may do so in the coming months. But I'd like to highlight that 25 of these 46 states parties have never submitted an annual report, despite being required to do so for 1 or more years. So I'm not counting those that are new and have the new obligation this year, but there are still many that have not done so. We gave a regional breakdown of those non-reporters. 48% are from Africa, 44% from the Americas, 8% from Europe. And just to further break it down, 32% of these states parties are among the least developed countries, and 44% are small island developing states. So again, capacity building, training on how to report is certainly a helpful tool to assure compliance. And again, we look at private reporting because it is a worrying trend, not just for the initial reports, but also for annual reports. Of the 59 states parties that have submitted those 2020 annual reports, 17 kept their reports private, making them only available to other states parties, so not open to analysis by Karina or I, for example. Of note, 3 states parties reported privately this year after previously submitting public reports. Again, it's unclear why we're seeing a general trend towards private reporting and an increasing trend, but also why states are electing to oscillate between private and public reporting from year to year. Just to give you a comparison, only 4% of the 2015, the first year that reports were due, only 4% were kept private. So again, we're seeing a growing trend. We have 10 states parties that have only ever submitted private reports, which is 13% of all states parties. States have choices when they submit their reports. Of the 42 publicly available reports that we could analyze, 27 used the ATT reporting template, 11 used the Secretariat's online reporting tool, and 4 used versions of their UN ROCA reports. This was the third year in which states parties had the option of using the ATT Secretariat's online reporting tool, and approximately 26% of the 42 states parties utilized the tool for their report. And that's an increase in use of the online reporting tool. There may be several reasons why states aren't using the online reporting tool or haven't done so consistently. But I think it is a good example of how the Secretariat is looking to try to simplify reporting practice and synergize with other reporting forms. And I hope that states continue to use that tool. For those that may not be familiar with the annual reports, this is required for states to report on their annual arms exports and imports. But even if they don't undertake any arms exports or imports in a calendar year, they are still obliged to report. So you can report on your exports, but then a nil report on your imports, or vice versa, or a nil report for both exports and imports. So 3 states parties this year submitted nil reports for arms exports and imports. 2 reported nil imports for exports only, and 1 reported a nil import for imports only. Over the last 6 years, the total number of nil reports has declined. And I think the reasonings for this could be varied, including that some states parties may be choosing not to submit annual reports if they think they have nothing to report, and so they just don't report at all. Or some states parties have indicated they were submitting nil reports for imports and exports, but then included information on exports or imports. And so I think there may be actual education happening with how to use the reporting tools. And so states are actually not submitting nil reports because they are submitting actual annual or export or import reports. I think there has been a little bit of confusion over time with the reporting template and ticking different boxes. And I think we're seeing that states are becoming more experienced with dealing with the reporting templates. And so I'm thinking that trend will continue. I just want to mention the relationship between the ATT and the UN Register of Conventional Arms, because that was really a very important connection when the treaty was negotiated. States parties can submit their UN ROCA report as their ATT report. And we saw that this year, 4 states parties have done so. France used a format that closely resembled its UN ROCA reporting form. The Netherlands and the United Kingdom submitted their UN ROCA form directly. Canada incorporated elements of the reporting form, and that's really welcome. There were 2 very puzzling things that we noticed when we were looking at UN ROCA and the ATT. First of all, 4 of the 28 states parties that submitted 2020 reports under both the ATT and UN ROCA submitted privately to the ATT despite submitting publicly to the UN ROCA. The UN ROCA is a public report, but they kept their ATT reports private. I can't tell you why, because I can't compare them, but that's an interesting point. And second, the Republic of Moldova and Uruguay both submitted UN ROCA reports, but have not yet submitted their annual reports to the ATT Secretariat, even though they could have used the same format. So again, there is an opportunity to educate states that if you submit your UN ROCA report, you may use that as well for your ATT report. Along the same lines of private reporting, we're noticing an increasing trend in providing information or providing information that states have withheld commercially sensitive and or nationally security related information, as they are allowed to do. So far, we have about 15% of states have indicated that they have submitted reports with withheld information. Again, we've seen a decline in the number of reports that withheld information, despite seeing a rise in the rate for the first 4 years of implementation. And again, we don't really know, because we don't know what information was withheld, what the reasons for that were, or what kinds of information is being withheld. I don't have time in this presentation to go through our findings on the imports and export sections of the report, but I will say that the report itself delves deeply into whether states reported on actual exports or export authorizations, what kinds of information were provided on small arms and light weapons exports, and similarly for imports, looking at authorizations or actual imports, as well as imports of small arms and light weapons. So just to conclude, and sort of what the title of this report refers to, what does this all mean? I've given you probably too much data. I've given you lots of trends that we have identified. So after these first 6 years of annual reporting, what do we know? Well, we can identify some enduring challenges. Compliance with the ATT's annual reporting requirement remains subpar. The on-time compliance rate never exceeds more than 50%. And with an average compliance rate of only 2/3 of states parties since 2016 overall, we're not seeing the reporting for annual reports live up to their intention. There's simultaneously an increasing trend towards private reporting, and more states parties than ever continuing to use private reporting. So we have declining compliance, increasing private reporting. That gives Karina and I far less information to analyze, but also makes it more challenging to identify trends, to identify assistance needs, to identify ways in which the treaty can be strengthened. There also seems to be continued confusion among some states parties on how to report. So there's uncertainties and discrepancies within the reports themselves, which can make it really difficult, again, to utilize these reports to their full potential. And I think finally, even when we do have states report, we're seeing an increase in data aggregation, which presents a really ongoing challenge for us. It limits understanding of arms exports and imports and complicates analysis of the global arms trade and transfers of concern, which can harms overall the objective and purpose of the ATT, which includes reducing human suffering and contributing to international and regional security. I never like to end on a down note, so I will just say there are some downward trajectory concerns, but I do think that there are some ongoing positive resolutions of and disruptions of things caused by the COVID pandemic, which gives states an opportunity to resume and refresh their reporting practices. The adoption at the 7th Conference of States Parties of new reporting forms or updated reporting forms, I think may help with some of the confusion around reporting. There's an FAQ that has been developed by the Working Group on Transparency and Reporting. The Secretariat runs a voluntary trust fund where states can go to get assistance to help with reporting. There are so many civil society tools to help with reporting and many lessons learned. So I am really looking forward to continuing to work not only with the states on our screen today, but with other states to improve reporting around the world. And with that, I will turn it back to Verity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Another excellent report from Stimson on this. And I'd like to remind the participants with us here today that the Q&A is open. Please do start to put your questions in there. Rachel didn't have time to talk about the imports exports, but maybe that's something you would like to hear a little bit more about. So please do pop your questions in and we'll get to them after all of our speakers have shared. Karina, the ATT Monitor is a huge undertaking. It's wonderful to see this year's annual report, and I look forward to your presentation to give us a bit more detail about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verity, and thank you, Rachel, Ambassador Gabrielsen, and Rainer And also Sarah, I mean, I'm very pleased to be on this panel today. It's very, I think, convenient and timely, you know, the discussion that Rachel just opened about transparency. And I think that the main point is also the question around today's event, right? Has the ATT lived up to its potential, to its promise, to its commitments? So my job today is going to be around the discussions that we presented at the launch, at the previous launch of the ATT Monitor 2021 annual report. I'm not going to necessarily repeat absolutely everything, but for those of you who joined us last time, there will be some unfortunate repetition, but I think it can also be seen as a positive reminder of where we are today. So let me please share my screen, my presentation first. There we go. Can you see it well? Yes, great. Thank you so much. So as Rachel just mentioned, transparency remains a big challenge in the context of the global arms trade. And so what I'm going to do in the next couple of minutes is I'm going to take you even back in time to present you with two distinct analyses that we conducted this year in the ATT annual report. Very briefly, let me just walk you through the contents of the report that we launched in August. So the first part of our report is the traditional year in review, in which we pretty much give a snapshot of where the treaty stands in relation to universalization, reporting and compliance, CSP procedures and systems. Our chapter, or a special chapter this year, which normally goes around the thematic priority of the presidency, of the CSP presidency, is on strengthening efforts to eradicate illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and ensure efficient stockpile management. And we did a very focused case on these practices in relation to sub-Saharan Africa. Chapter 2 this year is a very special one. It's an additional chapter that we added to our regular annual report, and this is thanks to the support of the German Federal Foreign Office. We were able to carry out a review of the first 5 years of ATT reporting, which I'm going to be presenting very shortly, and Rachel just focused on the initial reports, so I'm only going to focus on the annual reports. Then chapter 3 is our usual analysis of 2019 annual reports, which details the arms exports and imports and presents also our country profiles. And finally, chapter 4 is the ATT reporting updates, that when we present them in August, then Rachel comes as of today and gives us a pretty much update about the annual reports from 2020 that were due on 31st May this year, as well as the initial reports and updates to them, as Rachel just covered a couple of minutes ago. So before walking you through chapter 2, I wanted to also dedicate some minutes to our regular analysis in chapter 3. And the chapter in general covers a lot of ground because this is our in-depth analysis of annual reports. And in this chapter, we regularly look not only to the quantity of the reports submitted and the compliance with the reporting obligations, but we also look at the quality of the information provided in these reports. But this year in particular, there is something that I want to highlight, which is a trend that we saw when we started doing the report, which is that of late reporting. When we start our analysis, we have a cutoff date of 1st of February to start digging into the very data content of what each ATT annual report contains. And regularly, after that cutoff date of 1st of February, we receive we see that one or two annual reports are submitted after this date. But this year, we saw that 7 states parties submitted reports after our cutoff date. And I think that, this of course, marks the lowest on time completion until that point of our analysis, very likely due to the effects still of the pandemic. But one thing that I want to say about the 7 states parties that submitted and we couldn't include in our analysis of country profiles is that we did, though, include them in our analysis of chapter 2. So, so then moving to the country profiles, this is information that we've been providing for a couple of years now. It has started, I think, published in the ATT Annual Report 2018. And it looks back, so from as of today, we have country profiles from 2016 on. And this year we analyzed 40 state parties that submitted publicly available 2019 annual reports by our cutoff date of 1st February 2021. And each country profile provides data on key reporting practice metrics, a summary of areas of good practice, areas for improvement, and also a more detailed analysis of both export information and import information in terms of transfers. For the first time this year, we also included information on reports submitted and made publicly available or confidential for the past 5 years. And you see there in that little snapshot, how it looks in the country profile. So that will provide also a very good snapshot of the reporting practices of each state party that we analyze. So the country profiles have a lot of information. I just want to invite you to check them on our website. They are all updated as of this year. So you can take a look, compare each of your countries, how you're doing, what areas you can help us to improve as well. As Rachel said, sometimes, we manage data, we analyze the data that states parties publish. So if there's anything that sometimes you might find that is not well represented or not well described, it would be a really good opportunity for us to actually converse with you and see how that information can be better displayed. So now going into the chapter 2 of our annual report. This is a 5-year review chapter, and what we wanted to do, similarly to what other institutions are doing, is this exercise of taking stock of what's been going on since the ATT entered into force. And so in this chapter, we evaluate the first 5 years of ATT annual reporting, going from 2015 to 2019 annual reports, to determine whether such reporting has lived up to the promise and requirements of the ATT. And what we found is that, unfortunately, progress has been very slow, and that effectively reporting has yet to live to the promise of the ATT. So in this analysis, we look at 3 different reporting categories that are here displayed in this slide. First, we did an analysis to see whether reports are compliant with Article 13.3 reporting obligations. Second, we analyzed whether these reports contribute to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty, and as such are meaningfully transparent. And third, we went farther and we looked to see whether these reports can contribute or do contribute to higher standards of transparency. So for each reporting category, we established a specific criteria to evaluate the annual reports, and I'm going to go through them very quickly just in a moment. But I think it's worth to highlight that we undertook distinct evaluations for each of these categories, because we wanted to distinguish between what is a reporting obligation and the minimum information that the ATT Monitor project has determined that is needed to fulfill the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. So, for example, A report could be submitted after the reporting deadline and not be compliant with Article 13.3 obligations, but can still contribute to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. And I'm just gonna go through that, and we're gonna see some of those examples. So with relation to the first exercise, or this first category, Article 13.3 annual reporting requirements, we looked to see whether a report is submitted to the ATT Secretariat in the first place, is submitted on time within 1 week of the 31st May deadline or the de facto deadline of June 7th, and if it includes both exports and imports of conventional arms covered under Article 2.1 and or relevant nil reports. Yes, I think it's worth highlighting, the importance of nil reports as Rachel mentioned earlier today. And so the point of departure for our analysis is the number of reports due per calendar year. And as you can see there, from 2015 to 2019, it has gone up as naturally more states, one would assume more states join the ATT, more states are going to submit their reports. So this is our point of departure. And what we found after doing this analysis is that between 2015 and 2019, the percentage of states parties submitting annual reports has declined. So the number of states that had to submit increased, but the number of states that submitted effectively reports declined from 82% to 64%. And when we consider compliance with all the requirements of Article 13.3, we found that less than half of states parties have fulfilled all of these annual reporting requirements, so the three categories that I mentioned before, which is something you can see here. So we have a peak in 2018, and then a dip in 2019, which is very likely related to the late reporting trend that I just mentioned. Okay, so in this one and the second analysis, that's where we also get into the ATT monitor sort of more methodological issues. So we wanted to determine whether the annual reports fulfill the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty, which are there in the slide, Article 1, and if they were meaningfully transparent as well. And so the criteria we used to make this assessment was whether a report is submitted and made publicly available. So it might be submitted, but if it's confidential, there's no way that for us it would contribute necessarily. That provides information that is disaggregated by weapon type, that is disaggregated also by importer and exporter. Also, if it indicates whether the transfer information relates to either actual or transfer or authorized transfers. And also if it provides the number of units or financial value for each weapon type or both. And here is that what we found is that the percentage of reports each year that are meaningfully transparent is declining, but largely also to the overall declining in compliance rates and increasing rates of confidential reporting, as Rachel just mentioned earlier. So the percentage of reports due that are meaningfully transparent fell from 46% to 30% over this 5-year period of analysis. And so I think that there is a story here about the how concerning these trends are, right? When we look at the publicly available reports, the percentage of them that are meaningfully transparent has remained relatively consistent, indicating that the capacity among states might have also remained static. And so in both these figures, for instance, the number of meaningfully transparent reports is the same. The first figure, figure 2.5, shows the percentage of reports due that are meaningfully transparent. And so again, as the number of reports due increases, the percentage of transparent reports decreases. And the second figure, 2.6, shows the percentage of submitted publicly available reports that are meaningfully transparent according to the criteria that we set. And so the reports that are actually submitted publicly each year, the percentage is, as you can see, relatively consistent. And this is because we know that there are a group of states parties that report very consistently every year. And so this figure also suggests that the capacity among states, again, remain static. And finally, the last exercise we did was to go even further, as I said before, and to say, okay, are there any evidence of higher standards of transparency? Do we have stellar reporting states, right? And so what we decided to do is to analyze all these categories that are, all these criteria described there, right? If, for example, a report includes descriptions or comments, any indication that the transfers were not made. Like Rachel said, states can use the option to indicate that some information was withheld because of commercial sensitivity or national security reasons. But some states, have also opted in the past to indicate where. So this is, I think, something that can be seen as a positive trend among others. Other categories is, additional categories, national definitions. Have they submitted, for instance, a national report or an annex to the ATT reporting template, right? So, and in looking into all these criteria, not a single state provided all of this additional information, and not we would expect to do it because we look at each of these criterion individually. But we found, for example, that there is a group that of states parties that consistently submit publicly available reports that has increased the occurrence of comments and descriptions in their annual reports. So this is something positive because in our analysis, this contributes to a higher standard of transparency in annual reporting. And so as above, looking at these figures, we can see in the first that the percentage of reports due that include descriptions of arms transfers decreases as the number of reports due increases. But the percentage of publicly available reports that include description has increased slightly over time, as I just said. So the analysis is long, it's very heavy on data, but we have a few interesting findings, and I want to just mention two of the main ones, which is basically that in this analysis that we did, only 12 states parties have been fully compliant with Article 13.3 reporting obligations and have submitted reports that contribute to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. For every year, a report was due. And the last one is that only state parties have been fully compliant with the above, but have also included information that contributes to a higher standard of transparency. So our stellar reporters would be, in this analysis, only states parties. Finally, I wanted just to invite you to take a look at this information we just published, just as of this morning, as this analysis as separate pieces. They are in 3 languages on our website, in English, French, and Spanish. We think it's important to reach out to larger ATT stakeholders. And we also have included some cute summary videos for you to watch that we will be disseminating in the next couple of days. So I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Karina. I'm looking forward to getting stuck into that latest edition. And it now gives me really great pleasure to introduce Sarah. Sarah, like Rachel, has been involved with the ATT before it was the ATT during negotiations, and now as a stalwart of the ATT Secretariat, keeping the wheels on the train. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Sorry, just got to find my... good morning, everyone. Sorry, thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Stimson Centre for inviting the Secretariat to participate in this panel. Reporting is, of course, one of the central pillars of the ATT and one of the few measurable obligations in the treaty. So we're always very happy to have an opportunity to discuss reporting issues. I've been asked to give an overview of some of the Secretariat's priorities for reporting. There's already been a lot said by the other panelists concerning the rate of reporting and the apparent decline in the number of states parties that are submitting their annual reports, as well as the increase in the number or the proportion of reports that are not made publicly available. So I'm not going to repeat those messages, but rather I'm going to talk a little bit about how we as the Secretariat are planning to approach the first issue and also give some reflections on the second issue. So starting with reporting rates, some of the actions that we will be taking in the coming cycle to help states parties to meet their reporting obligations. Starting with reporting templates, the first thing to note, as Rachel has already mentioned, is that the revised reporting templates were endorsed by CSP7. This is something the Secretariat spent a lot of time on in collaboration with the co-chairs of the Working Group on Transparency and Reporting during the CSP6 and CSP7 cycles. And we provided a lot of input and drafting suggestions based on our analysis of some of the challenges that states seem to be facing in completing the reporting templates, as well as some of the omissions from the original templates. The revised reporting templates have been translated and they are available in Word and PDF on the website. We're also in the process of having the revised reporting templates integrated into the online reporting platform in all languages. And this should be available in the coming months, certainly well in advance of the next annual reporting deadline in May 2022. We also think that the endorsement of the revised reporting templates creates an opportunity to encourage states parties that have submitted their initial reports to consider updating their initial reports using the revised templates. As Rachel mentioned in her presentation, many states submitted their reports some 4 years ago or more, their initial reports, and those are now potentially somewhat out of date. We'll also use the endorsed revised templates as a friendly reminder to those states that have not yet submitted their initial reports at all. States parties do receive automated reminders that they have outstanding reports. And in addition, both the CSP6 and the CSP7 presidents sent individual reminder letters to all states with outstanding reports. And we will be supporting the CSP8 president to do the same. So in summary, we will be highlighting the endorsement of the revised reporting templates to states parties and using it as an opportunity to remind those with outstanding reports or outdated initial reports. Moving on to the second element, most of you will be aware, I'm sure, that the European Union has generously provided funding to the ATT Secretariat for several projects that support ATT implementation. And one of those is designed to build the capacity of ATT national points of contact, many of whom have a significant role in reporting by their state. One of the things that we want to gauge through this project is how many NPCs are involved in ATT reporting, what level of engagement do they have in reporting, and how does this vary across different states? And in addition to that, the project will develop a practical guide for national points of contact, which will of course include information on reporting, what the reporting obligation is and how to do it. A third element is some of you may recall that we initiated a project to facilitate voluntary, practical, bilateral and regional assistance with reporting, that is sort of peer-to-peer support early in the CSP6 cycle. The first step was to host a meet and greet event between delegates that expressed an interest in receiving assistance on reporting and delegates that have consistently been involved with reporting in their state and who offered their support to the project. And we divided participants into groups according to language. And basically delegates with lots of reporting experience gave advice to those who were new to reporting or had specific questions on the template. We did actually receive enthusiastic feedback from participants, and our intention was to repeat this exercise and gradually expand it at the ATT meetings that followed. Unfortunately, COVID put a dampener on those plans because we didn't have any face-to-face meetings until CSP7, which was just held in August, which of course was a hybrid meeting, not a full in-person meeting. And we didn't feel that the model was mature or developed enough to try holding that kind of meeting, that kind of exchange virtually. But we are confident that we will be in a position to repeat the exercise during the CSP8 cycle. And we're hoping it will gather some momentum so that reporting assistance clinics will become a feature of ATT meetings and delegates may contact each other outside the formal process via email or telephone for assistance with reporting. We're also hopeful it will give us some insight into more of the specific challenges that states parties face with reporting generally and the template specifically, because we're hoping to get feedback from those that are giving assistance during these reporting clinics, these peer-to-peer meetings. Perhaps the final thing to mention is we do intend to focus a bit on non-reporting states parties during this cycle. We've done the analysis that tells us that 55 states parties have submitted all their annual reports, 20 have submitted some but not all of their annual reports, and 30 have not submitted any of their annual reports. And of course, a further 5 are not yet due to submit reports. And the ATT monitor, I think, contains a similar analysis on this. Now, our assumption is that states that have submitted some but not all their annual reports probably face different challenges to those that have never reported and maybe require different support or assistance. So our intention is to undertake some targeted outreach to both categories, the partial reporters and the non-reporters, for want of a better term, to gain a better understanding of why they're not reporting or not reporting fully and how we can help address this. So moving on to the other central topic that was under discussion, the increase in the number of reports that have not been made public. I just wanted to make a few reflections on this. You'll be aware that the Working Group on Transparency and Reporting co-chairs have included the exchange of practices, challenges and limitations concerning the public availability of reports in the mandate for the next cycle. So I don't want to preempt their work, but I think there are some observations that can be made that could help frame their discussions and some nuances. I wouldn't say they're patterns yet, but some nuances that may provide some insight into why some states parties choose to restrict the availability of their reports to states parties only. And this should inform our approach to this issue. So firstly, there are some states parties that consistently restrict their reports. And if we take a look at their geopolitical situation, we can pretty much guess why. And we can also probably predict that their behavior will not change anytime soon. Then there are some states who generally make their reports publicly available, but then there'll be a random year where they restrict their report and the next year it'll be public again. And so here the restriction seems anomalous, random. Maybe there was an error. Maybe they exported something in that particular year that was particularly sensitive. We don't really know. And then there are states that made their annual reports publicly available in the early years, but started restricting them in recent years. Maybe there was a change in the geopolitical situation. Maybe there was a change in policy or a change in the person or entity responsible for reporting. And then finally, you have a few states that are new to reporting, and Rachel touched on this. They're not major importers or exporters. They're not part of Vazana. They never have reported to UNROCA. So for them, reporting on arms transfers is a novelty. It's a new experience. And in many instances, it's the Ministry of Defence that's tasked with reporting. And I think it's fair to say that defence ministries, by default, by their nature, are cautious about sharing information, especially information that is sensitive for national security purposes. And one anecdote that I can share with you on this involved a state reporting for the first time. The report we received indicated it should be made available to states parties only. So we wrote back acknowledging receipt, and as we always do, we indicate that the report will be posted on the restricted area of the website as per the indicated preference. We then received a response from the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, no, the report should be on the public part of the website. We say, okay, but then you need to please resubmit a revised version of the report that indicates that it's not just for states parties. Because obviously we cannot just rely on an email exchange. The report itself has to reflect the state's preference clearly. So we wait and nothing happens. And then a couple of months later, we get a reply saying, oh no, actually it's okay. The report can stay in the restricted area for now. Now the report had been completed by the Ministry of Defence, but submitted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What was clear to us is that the Ministry of Defence had a very different interpretation of how the information should be treated. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is at the ATT meetings, hearing about transparency and its importance, has an understanding of what happens to the information once it is submitted. Maybe the Ministry of Defence has heard very little about the arms trade treaty, has no idea what the process is or where the information will end up. And so maybe they need more time to get comfortable with the process, more information on the benefits of sharing information with the broader public. So in summary and in conclusion on this point, I'm just trying to illustrate that there are different categories of states that have chosen to make their reports available to states parties only. And if the process wants to influence that behavior, then we do need a better understanding of what is motivating that choice. If I may, just while I have the floor, just take this opportunity to clarify something that Raina said. You mentioned the desirability of establishing a panel of high-ranking specialists, I think you said, to screen states' reports and provide feedback on how they could be improved. I think the Secretariat's view of this proposal was simply that the mandate and the terms of reference for such a structure within the ATT would need to be discussed and agreed in advance by states parties before it could become a formal process or formal mechanism. That's all. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I think your reflection there about the differences that different ministries come to this reporting requirement with is one that I've experienced in all of the training events with states officials that we've run. We often bring together people from Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministries of Defence, and there is that education work to do about why transparency in this forum is desirable and also obligated, so in many ways. I thought, first of all, before coming to the questions we have from the audience, I would just turn to our government representatives and ask if they had any reflections on the presentations that you've heard, or anything that particularly rang true to you as one of the trends that's being identified as a barrier to increased and full transparency within the ATT. Please, Robert.
Well, thank you very much. And I mean, this was very useful. I hope also for the participants. It's clear that the trends are not good. And it's also good what Sarah mentioned, all the tools, and I think all of you mentioned this, all the tools which are there for states to help them. Maybe it is necessary to have a kind of a targeted outreach, as Sarah mentioned it, because there are different countries with different motivations of not reporting fully or not reporting at all, or keeping the reports private. Maybe partly it's misunderstandings. Maybe it also has to do with the notion they don't recognize the purpose and the advantages for themselves of reporting. Yes, it is a cumbersome task. It's not easy, and I can understand those who are responsible for it would rather, you know, try to avoid it. And there is this tension between the MODs and the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, maybe about this. So maybe there should be indeed an outreach, and maybe there this idea of Rainer came in of tackling this problem. So maybe we still have to analyze what is the reasons of not reporting, keeping it private, or not reporting enough, because it can be different for different countries. So I think we need that feedback, and then to tackle the problem. And any creative idea, I think, is very welcome. And maybe the idea Rainer had is also welcome, but probably it has to work out a little bit more. But the trends are clearly not good. And it has to be tackled, because otherwise the whole purpose of ATT is gone, because it has to do with transparency, and we all have an insight in the arms trade, and we have little tools. We have Oroka and we have this, and if we really want to make it work, we need this data, and this is in the benefit of all of us. And I think this is really something we have to stress. And we have to reach out to countries who either not see this or are hesitant to give their information. But again, thank you very much for all the information you provided. Thank you, Verity.
Thank you. And Mr. Schmiesjen, would you like to offer any reflections on the presentations?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to. Seeing Karina Solmirano, again, I would like to apologize, to ask your pardon. I mentioned some of these organizations in my little intervention. I forgot the Partners of Control Arms. It was a terrible mistake. Sorry for that. Control Arms is most important. Thanks and sorry. And targeted outreach, Robert, that was the magic word for me. Outreach, most of the cases means like universalization. That's perhaps the most important target for outreach. but I take your advice. We should include the subject of transparency and reporting in our outreach activities. And my word as a representative of the acting presidency, I have that in the back of my mind. Let us think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn to the questions we have from our participants. And the first one from Gregory Sanders. Are the parts of the ATT reports you think that the larger international security, national defence analyst communities should be diving into as part of our research? I hope that by using and encouraging colleagues to use this data, we can encourage reporting, but it's often hard to tell where to start given incompleteness challenges. Karina, I wonder if I can come to you. I know that for many years, the ATT monitor used to look at what we call the discrepancies between the reporting. And actually that piece of work we decided to not do after a certain period of time because there were other areas that the monitor wanted to focus on. But I wonder, you know, from the behind the scenes thinking in your team, if you had more capacity to be doing more research on top of what you already do with the data, where would you encourage others to be looking and what could they usefully be trying to draw out?
Yeah, thank you very much, Verity. And I was going to mention that actually to Greg, that Gregory. I think Gregory, I think he was a colleague of mine at the university. So if I'm not mistaken, his name. So we used to do the discrepancy analysis, which again, for a number of reasons, we stopped doing it last year, but mostly because of capacity issues, you know, as you know, we mentioned that states sometimes lack capacity and sometimes projects also are you know, with a low capacity when you focus on other areas. And so as we moved the project into doing this more in-depth analysis of the country profiles, you know, we found that, you know, we would need more time perhaps and more resources, you know, to dedicate to really look into the differences that might exist in what each country reports. And so in the past, this discrepancy analysis compared basically if the information reported by an exporter and that reported by an importer matched in not only in terms of the quantity of weapons that have been reported to be transferred, but also, you know, whether the value, the financial value, the number of units, that type of information, you know, is super, super helpful, I think, for the type of outside analysis that maybe, you know, think tanks or the academic community do. I think the information is there sometimes. It's just a question of delving into and diving into each of the annual reports. Sometimes, depending on the country, it could be that there's a lot of information, and sometimes it could be that there's not a lot of information. But at the same time, I think it requires also to consider the discrepancies that also might exist from year to year, not only from country, from importer to exporter, but also from year to year. As mentioned, I think by Rachel and also Sarah, sometimes the states report differently from year to year. And that also is a challenge, I think, for the defense or the international security community to do consistent analysis, because if the information is not consistent, then the analysis risks also being very inconsistent. But I think there are opportunities to use the data. I would also suggest to compare also with other reporting instruments in that sense, right? We are conducting now an exercise that will be published by the end of the year, in which we are looking into transfers reported to both the ATT and UN ROCA, or to one and not to the other, in the context of countries that are undergoing certain crises, either humanitarian ongoing conflicts or cases like Myanmar, where there occur another military coup. So we will be looking into that as well. So I think that's another area of potential research that other institutions, you know, also might want to look. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karina. Rachel or Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, I would just say that there is a wealth of information in the annual reports. I mentioned in my presentation that the aggregation of the data makes it incredibly difficult to sort of parse out some larger trends about what kinds of systems are being transferred to whom, how many, and part of the purpose of transparency in the ATT is to have a more complete global picture of the international arms trade. We're seeing differences from year to year, how states report. We see different processes. So some states wait until it's an actual import, whereas another state may report on the authorization. And so even in a calendar year, it's hard to get a global picture. There's differences in reporting for states between heavy conventional weapons and small arms and light weapons. So even how a state reports in their same report is often quite challenging. But there is, if you are diligent and you follow up, there are also other sources of information, publicly available information on arms exports and imports that you can use to compare and see what might be missing or how states are choosing to report to the ATT. But at the core, this is not just transparency for transparency's sake. We're trying to identify trends in the global arms trade, identify potentially destabilizing arms transfers, work cooperatively to ensure that weapons are being securely managed and stored and transferred. So there's a lot of purpose to these reports, and it would be helpful if others, whether it's academics or governments or civil society, are looking at these reports in more detail so that states recognize that there's an importance to them, that it's not just Karina and I and CIPRI and UNIDIR that are looking at these, but that these really serve a purpose that is useful for all states.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to move on to a question from Corey Bott now, from the Human Equity Fund. And he asks, could we explore the probable reasons for states not reporting or reporting privately? E.g., is it strategic, security, lack of resources, diplomatic relations, etc.? And I think many of the presentations have touched on this in your opening, in your presentations and remarks. But I wonder if we can go a little bit further now, or Sarah, if there's any more that you can share about the way you're going to conduct this outreach and whether there are roles for civil society and others to support that work and to make it very meaningful for the CSP community.
Sure, thanks, Verity. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, as you just said, we all mentioned the need for some targeted outreach to identify the probable reasons that states are not reporting or are not reporting publicly. But I think it's necessary that we approach those in two separate ways, obviously, because the reasons that states are not reporting is probably quite different from the reasons they are reporting privately. So I think the first is easier to tackle, and certainly in terms of the targeted outreach, I think we are at the point, as I said, where we will be approaching states directly. There are 30 or so that have never reported. That's not a huge number. So we need to reach out to them individually through their missions here, through the contacts that we have, and have those discussions. And I think that's something that definitely civil society could also engage in, and I think probably already is in the liaisons they have and the projects that they're running and all the capacity building that's been done by civil society out in the field. I think those questions do arise, whether we're sort of sharing information on the findings of that. Maybe we could all do a bit more on collaborating on that. But the second issue, asking why states are not reporting publicly, is a bit more politically sensitive, because of course states do have the prerogative to keep their reports restricted. That's the interpretation that's been given. So it's difficult. I mean, just from our perspective, for example, when we receive a report that is noted as restricted, we are not in a position to say, could you tell us why this is restricted? Because if we do that, we'd also have to say to states that make it publicly available, why do you make this publicly available? You know, to give fair treatment, because states have that prerogative. So we're not in a position to sort of to question their ability to do that. So all we do is we say, we note that we've received your report. We note that you want it on the restricted area of the website. Please know that there will be piece of information on the website that says you've submitted, but it's restricted. That's as far as we go. And we do it like that to alert them to the fact that it's going to be publicly known that you have restricted your report. And that's as far as we can go. So in terms of how we approach states and ask them why they're submitting their reports privately, I think the answer probably lies to some extent in the analysis I gave before about the 4 different categories. I think we have an instinct about some that are it's geopolitical reasons and so on, and we can have discrete conversations with them, but we can't push them too hard. But for others, where it may be that lack of experience or lack of exposure to the ATT process and reporting generally, we maybe can discuss this, and you mentioned it in the follow-up to my presentation. We do need to share information, more education about what transparency means and what happens to the information in your report. And maybe that's another way to tackle it, is to let states feel comfortable and confident about how their information is going to be used and where it's going to be made available. I'll let the other two maybe feed in a little bit more on their thoughts on how civil society can contribute to the process of asking those questions.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'll come over to Rachel now. And I would be interested also in our government representatives' views on this, without putting you on the spot to comment on the state's behaviour, but maybe to share some general views about the barriers that some of your colleagues are facing in this. But first, Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Verity. We've actually done some survey research for states on why they have both chosen to report privately and what kinds of challenges that they face. As part of this project that I mentioned on the outset, that's funded by Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, we are undertaking both survey questions and interviews, and produced in advance of CSP7 a fact sheet, and we can probably put the link in the chat, about the 4 main types of challenges that states have indicated affect their ability to complete or submit the report. And there are 4 main categories: awareness and understanding of the ATT obligations. We've all talked about this repeatedly, about when to report, how to report, what it should look like. Obviously, capacity and resource challenges, which refer to things like limited time or personnel or information management systems. So sometimes it's really just having the ability to collect and collate this information. Internal and bureaucratic challenges, which often have to do with coordination amongst government agencies, complications, accessing or compiling or assessing relevant information. So maybe they have it, but they don't have the expertise to assess what they have. And then, of course, political and security challenges, where states are concerned about what information was shared with whom, and then other competing government priorities that sometimes the ATT falls to a secondary priority level. When we asked states in our survey that we conducted with CIPRI earlier this year, why are you submitting privately? Sometimes we had boxes ticked that said, oops, by mistake. We've remedied, and Sarah referenced that, right? Where sometimes she has to actually call and say, did you mean to do this? Or both boxes are ticked, or hopefully the new template will avoid some of those problems. And then we had responses like, we have concerns related to the release of information regarded as sensitive. So that's, for both the initial and annual report, sometimes there are government practices that states don't want to make available to non-state parties of the ATT. So I think the reasons are varied. I think Sarah is absolutely right. This is an area where additional both education and assistance can be of help, because when I have gone around the world and conducted workshops, states want that assistance. Sometimes we sit together and they bring all of their government agencies personnel in one room, and they fill out the report while we're sitting there to ensure that it's often submitted. We've had cases where we're doing a workshop and someone raises their hand and says, wait, we're listed as not having submitted, but I personally did that report, and we discovered that it was stuck in the mission and no one had ever pressed send to get it to the Secretariat. So sometimes, it's just having the conversations allow us to identify some of these easily solved problems. And sometimes these discussions uncover areas where there can be further assistance. And I think Sarah mentioned some really exciting and new opportunities that the Secretariat has to do that coordinated outreach. And we have always really welcomed the partnership and collaboration with the Secretariat to identify ways in which civil society can assist, where states can assist, where the Secretariat has a role to play. And I think it really is a collective effort to address some of these enduring challenges that we've uncovered in the many years that we've all done these events together.
Thank you, Rachel. Rainer.
Thank you. The question reminds me a little bit of Sigmund Freud, who once said that there are only two motivations for people for doing something. And having said that, I would think that we should add the word assistance to targeted outreach. We could open our participants list here and we could check how many people of those states who are not so proper in reporting would have joined us. So we have to advertise, we have to offer help, we have to offer assistance, and we have to remind people from time to time. Perhaps we form regional groups on reporting or something similar. But assistance is the key word, and for me as a German, and I think it's the same for Robert, we have these highly specialized, super effective civil servant systems. If the German state or the Dutch state, if they want some information, it is done in no time, and then it's just a political will or the decision of certain civil servants to publish it. That's no problem, but the framework conditions in other states are much more difficult. And then one thing I would like to rule out, it's definitely not diplomatic relations which prevent states from reporting in a transparent way. But anyway, assistance, target outreach. Let's focus on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert.
No, thank you very much. I don't want to speculate too much on the reasons which countries will not report or late or keep it private. I think the four reasons Rachel mentioned, I mean, three of them are technical and can be addressed. It's only the political insecurity if there's a deliberate decision not to do it for whatever reason or keep it private. Then you know that's. They thought about it and they will not do it. The other three you can tackle, and this is also what Rainer said and Sarah. I mean, this needs a targeted approach. So how can we assist you? We coming out of a Corona crisis where meetings were not possible. So the meetings Rachel alluded to are not possible anymore. So you cannot sit, around the table with country representatives and see how can we assist you. The tools are there. So those who want to use it can use the tools and can get all this assistance they need. Of course, you also have to go bureaucratically through this process once. Once you go through it and you have your data and you've done it, it's a matter of updating. So you have to go once through this whole process. You know how it works internally, you know how to report, etc. So once you've done this, it becomes a bit more easier in the years afterwards, and you can, improve it. So that needs some assistance. But some countries, we have to reach out. The assistance is there, the tools are there. So how to reach them? And that is coming back to the discussion we just had before. Different countries have different motivations and different reasons. So we have to get these reasons. And it's good that Rachel made that research. So these are the four reasons why countries do not report or not sufficiently. And again, three of them can be tackled. The other one is a deliberate decision, political security. That is, we don't discuss that. But the other three you can tackle. Thank you. I see Verity has an assistant. Good to see it.
I do. He's just a bit of a bump. Thank you. So
yeah, I mean, that's what you have. I mean, they need some assistance, and if the mommy is all the time busy, that's boring.
Yeah.
It's a her.
Well,
yeah. Hello.
It's a little boy. This is Connor. and he's very brave. But I just wanted to finish by saying thank you so much to all of our panelists and for everybody who's joined us today. This session has been recorded and it will appear on the Stimson website shortly. Let's spread it. Let's send it to those who weren't here today so that they can also benefit from all of your excellent contributions. Rachel, I'm going to hop off now, but thank you all ever so much. Have a good rest of the day or morning. Thanks. Bye-bye.